When I was in my teens and my early 20s, a good few years ago now, I attended a number of Salvation Army summer camps at a place in Kent called Cobham Hall. These were action-packed weeks for me. Lots of sport, lots of music, loads of food, and not a lot of sleep. And maybe even a bit of romance, if you were lucky. And of course, the chance to consider what it might mean to follow Jesus Christ as a young adult. I know that Cobham Hall represented a very formative experience for many people. Among the highlights every year was the point in the final concert when the whole school, staff and students, sang a song of dedication. I will never forget those precious moments. You could have heard a pin drop as we sang words like these, written by Catherine Baird. I come to thee with quiet mind, thyself to know, thy will to find. In Jesus' steps, my steps must be. I follow him to follow thee. 1 Peter is a book in the New Testament, and it's thought to have been written by Peter, one of Jesus' closest friends and most trusted disciples. The letter's written to other Christians scattered around, and it's written to encourage them to stand firm and to hold tight in their faith. Peter calls them exiles and foreigners because although they're living in this world, they're not of this world, and they're not walking in step with this world. Peter calls his fellow believers to live lives that are marked out by radical holiness, lives that reflect their new birth as God's children, lives that make a big impression on the people around them, and lives that are costly, because at the end of the day, the road of discipleship won't always be an easy one or a popular one. And then he hits them with this line: to this you were called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 21. That you should follow in his steps. Peter was writing hundreds of years ago. His context was, of course, very different to ours. But his words also speak to encourage us today in the 21st century. Because we live in an increasingly post-Christian nation. And to be a Christian today is to live as an exile in your own land. Walking in step with Jesus Christ still means walking out of step with the world. Verse 24 of chapter 2 tells us this: Christ himself bore our sins in his body on the cross so that we might die to sins and live to righteousness. That's great. But if you're anything like me, there will almost certainly have been times in your life which were marked not by righteousness, but by unrighteousness and self-righteousness even. Times when you've perhaps bought into a different dream, when you've lost sight of the Christ and of the cross, when you've wandered from the pathway of faith and you've ended up way out of step with Jesus Christ. So, as we journey towards the cross this week, and as the events of Holy Week gain an unstoppable momentum, I invite you to stop, and I invite you to ask yourself, what might it mean for me to walk in Jesus' steps, along the path of service, the path of sacrifice, the path of surrender? And what needs to change in my life in order for that to happen? I come to thee with quiet mind, thyself to know, thy will to find. In Jesus' steps, my steps must be. I follow him to follow thee. This week, no matter where our journeys have taken us, no matter what detours we've taken or what blind alleys we've walked down in life, may we quieten our minds. May we seek and find God's will for us. May we choose to live for righteousness. And may we walk in the very steps of Christ, the Christ of Calvary, with fresh resolve as we follow him all the way to the cross.
Amen.